Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Premier Pundits podcast. Much later than scheduled. I'm joined by my esteemed guest, the fantasy doc himself, Raj Brar, 3CB Performance. How are you, my friend? It has been a while.
It has been extremely busy week. A lot going on with injuries, as you know. And so, how are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. I must admit, I'm looking forward to the end of the season, Raj. And as you alluded to, it's been a very, very busy week. In fact, it's been so busy, I've had to write down a list of the players that we need to cover this week because I don't want to miss anybody out. And unfortunately, it's not good news. But for those who are interested in injuries, like we are, then it is good news because we've got plenty to talk about. And carrying on from last week's theme, we had a current undertone of a glut of knee injuries. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's continued this week, unfortunately. We've seen several players, unfortunately, ruled out for the remainder of the season and potentially for a large bulk of the remainder of this year. And I want to start off with Trezeguet at Aston Villa because information regarding what potentially happened against Liverpool last weekend is sketchy at best. We won't hear from Dean Smith until Friday. And for those that didn't see the incident, it involved Trezeguet with quite an innocuous coming together with Trent Alexander-Arnold. It didn't look great. Went down, had a little bit of treatment, tried to continue, but then, obviously the pain got a little bit greater. He had medical treatment, and I think he knew from that point that the player was distraught. He was visibly upset, and he went straight off down the tunnel. Now, the club have actually confirmed that it is a knee ligament injury, and he has already had surgery, again, like I say, which will rule him out for the remaining games. Having seen the incident, Raj, in your opinion, what type of injury do you think Trezeguet may have suffered there?
It looked like, unfortunately, an ACL injury. And so that's typically, you're looking at, depending on the return to play protocol, 8-ish months when it comes to footballers. And so it's just an unfortunate injury. It looked, like you said, looked relatively innocuous when it happened. But with contact injuries, putting that amount of force through something, it can be something where it evolves and it's far more serious than you initially thought.
Yeah, and you mentioned it was unfortunate. It was a bit of a coming together. One of the questions, because we've just seen Trezeguet was introduced from the bench against Fulham, got himself on the score sheet, and that merited a start in the Aston Villa lineup for the following game week. So he hasn't had much first team involvement, and the start against Liverpool was one of a few only this year. Is the fact that he hasn't been playing regularly in that first team, could that be one of a contributing factor maybe to why he suffered it, or was it just purely down to bad luck?
I would say it's possible that because he hasn't been playing that much, his fitness level may not be up to par with guys who have played consistently, which can then contribute to injury risk. But overall, I would just say with a contact injury, it's just unfortunate in that regard.
Yeah. Look, we kind of talk Aston Villa without mentioning Jack Grealish. And, Dean Smith has faced a lot of flack in terms of, suggested return to play timeline. And quite rightly so now, he's closed up shop. And we'll see it week by week. Given the fact that Jack had already missed sort of 4 weeks before that setback in training, would you expect, given, again, the information that we have to hand, would you expect ordinarily for Jack to be at least another 4 weeks and possibly longer, given that, that it was a recurrence and it was a re-injury, and Villa will want to manage Jack that, a little bit more carefully?
It's so hard to say. When they say re-injury, was it as severe? Was it a setback, right? That's what really determines that timeline. And with those injuries, they're so sensitive, whether it's, my guess, like we talked about when it first happened, it's a bone stress injury. Those can just be really sensitive, and you have to be proactive with their management. So quite hard to say. It really is a week-to-week timeline.
I mean, of course, the reason that I mentioned Jack Grealish is because I've got one eye on the Euro 2021 championships. And another England international potentially who's at risk of missing out is Declan Rice. Now, the club have remained very coy in providing updates. David Moyes playing his cards very close to his chest. But respected journalist David Ornstein came out and he said that it's an LCL injury. He actually termed it was an unusual LCL injury. I'm not really sure what he meant by that. But the initial timeline given was 4 to 6 weeks. 6 weeks would push him up to the upper limits of this season. But they'll hope that he could possibly return realistically within 4. Now, given, again, what you know of the injury itself, is a 4-week turnaround and Declan Rice maybe playing again this season, is that realistic?
I think it is, especially if it's a grade 1 injury. Based on how he did it, there was nothing really significant. When I looked at the video, my guess is it's a grade 1. And then I know Ornstein mentioned this, that based on Rice's previous fitness, which can help with injury recovery, they are hoping he's able to get back. I mean, I've seen some of it. I think he had some rehab videos recently or pictures that he came out with. So it looks like he is on track. I think he's far more on track with that type of injury where it's more definitive than with a Grealish type injury where it's very much play it by ear and you're trying to limit the force through those shins. So if I had to bet, I would think Rice would play more so than Grealish, although that's not saying Grealish won't play. Yeah. It's just if I had to, put money on it.
Yeah, I think the Declan Rice is a lot more black and white in terms of what we can expect, whereas there's so many influencing factors with regards to Jack Grealish's recovery. We're just not able to, pin anything definitive on that. But sticking with the Euros, and we heard from Paul Heckingbottom today as Sheffield United ahead of game week 32. And unfortunately, there's confirmation that not one, but 2 of his squad members, again, will miss the run into injury. One of those being Billy Sharp, who suffered a thigh injury that they were hoping to treat conservatively, but he ended up going for surgery this week. And secondly, Ollie McBurney came on as substitute against your team, Arsenal, last weekend, and then was substituted late on, and it was immediately taken to hospital. And there were concerns from the club doctor that there had been a break or a fracture, which was subsequently being confirmed again. So that's a 5th metatarsal fracture. Now, we're recording on the 15th of April, and Scotland are due to kick off their Euro campaign on the 14th of June. Now, the hopes of Scotland would be pinned maybe on Ollie McBurney, one of their key players. Big question marks on whether he can make the tournament, do you think? Or, is he another one where you would think you'd be fairly confident of a recovery?
I'm pretty confident. Let's say if he has a quote, they call it Jones fracture, which is a 5th metatarsal injury. If you can pin that, it's about a 6-week return timeline, maybe 8, which would be pushing up against it. So odds are that he is back for that, which is great news, for them at Euros. But it really just comes down to the specifics of that injury and also how it heals. The reason why they have to pin that area is because it's a watershed area. There's no blood flow to it. But surgery is pretty successful, and it's a pretty quick return to play.
Yeah. And because regardless of whether it's a 6 or an 8-week timeline, Ollie McBurney isn't going to have much of an opportunity to sort of play him into those games. The chances are he may be thrown in at the deep end. And is that an injury that can really stand up to the rigors of being thrown straight back into that competitive environment?
Yeah, and that's always a great question. I mean, there's always going to be that re-injury risk when you don't have that ramp up. And it's not just for that injury, it's for any other injury as well. Like we know with soft tissue injuries, when you don't have a proper ramp up period, you come back, you're at much higher risk, to do a hamstring, something else like that. You can be quite susceptible. So he's going to be at higher risk for Euros for sure.
Yeah, so fingers crossed with that one. Now you touched upon re-injury, and we cannot overlook a major setback for Jonny, which was almost 2 weeks ago now. We actually missed it on our last update. But Jonny, for those that don't know, suffered a setback in training, which was an ACL and an MCL rupture. Same right knee as he'd done before at the start of the season in a Europa League qualifying game. And, he's going to spend a significant amount of time on the treatment table. I think potentially, we're looking at maybe 2022 before he's back in action. But from the outside looking in, and questions are being asked, Jonny was returning to playing around about 180 or so days. That 6 month timeline. Professionally speaking, in terms of when you're looking at return to play timeline, and we're not questioning the Wolves medical team by any stretch, and because their data, the way they've managed their players in recent times, it's been second to none. It's been exemplary. But from an outsider looking in, was that return to play for Jonny to you? Was that a surprise? And are there inherent risks with returning to play within that, that type of short 6 to 7 month period?
Yeah, regardless of my opinion, there's actually recent research showing that if you return prior to 9 months after an ACL, I think you're at a 6 times higher likelihood of re-injuring that ACL. And so these expedited return to play protocols are relatively new. And so we're starting to see some of the overall data. Of course, that data is not only for elite footballers, right, which skews it probably a little bit, but there does seem to be some re-injury risk associated with returning earlier. Now, as you said, with the Wolves medical team, they're one of the best, if not the best medical staff in the Premier League. And I'm sure they have all their medical checks and benchmarks in place. But there's certainly some concern for me whenever a player comes back before that 9 month period, just because the ligament takes longer to integrate. You're going to have these long-standing deficits, whether it's not physically, it could be mentally too. So with the kinesiophobia aspect, fear of movement, and that's quite hard to quantify or measure as well.
Yeah, I think one of the big surprises for me as well, and this, again, we could maybe relate to the unique environment and the times that we find ourselves in. If I recall, Jonny featured in a bounce game for Wolves, and then all of a sudden he was thrown straight back into that first team competitive, and he started. And yes, he was on reduced minutes. I think he might have done, 55, 60, and then gradually built up. Whereas inherently, in times gone by, there would have been more friendlies, non-competitive games, maybe integrated with the under-23s. Maybe Wolves' poor league form possibly contributed to that, that return to play timeline. And yeah, just unfortunate in a because it's a re-injury, because it's a recurrence of that initial ACL, can we therefore assume that his return to play again timeline would be extended beyond, that previous sort of 6 week period? Is this something where we maybe is looking at, is it next year now before realistically Jonny could return?
I would imagine as such. One, they might be a little more conservative with him just based on what happened. But secondly, like you said, now is a second insult to that knee. So any deficits he currently has are now going to be even more exacerbated, and he loses even more fitness because, again, extended recovery. And now we also know he has that MCL injury as well. Multi-ligament always tends to add a little bit time to the rehab timeline.
Yeah, and sticking with Wolves, and it's the last one for this week anyway. We've just had the unfortunate update that Wolves teammate and Portuguese star, he's been one Wolves' shining lights this season in Pedro Neto. Now, there was a little bit of a, maybe I was going to say confusion initially around, the precise nature of his injury. I had been talk that Neto was injured playing for Portugal and he was managing a knee problem, which may have been, exacerbated or further problems against Fulham. But we now know that he suffered a separate injury against Fulham, and he's had surgery for what we understand to believe to be a fractured patella. And they've put a conservative timeline of maybe around about 6 months return to play. Now, this is not an injury that we see very often within the Premier League. So we don't have a big data set in terms of, how long it takes to get those players involved again. But from what we do have, that 6 month seems a little bit optimistic in terms of what we've seen previously. So it's a serious, it is a serious setback, and there are big problems on that front. Could you just talk to us a little bit about, why that injury is? I mean, is it a complicated injury? What are the issues that he's going to have to deal with? And, do we think Pedro Neto could be playing football again this year?
Yeah, well, firstly, to your first point was that, I thought it was articular cartilage based off kind of what I had heard connecting the dots. And so I had a video. I was obviously wrong on that. And that would be actually, to me, a better injury than a fractured patella, which can be difficult. So essentially with the fractured patella, you go in and they're probably going to pin it, right, to stabilize it. And the hard part with the patella is that whenever you move your knee up or down, that patella has to slide. And so it needs to be very, very mobile for movement, especially so obviously for a footballer. And so that's why it can be such a difficult injury to deal with, is because the mechanics of the patella are really, really important to knee function. As you said, we don't really have much data on patellar fractures. 6 months does sound a bit optimistic to me. I believe the only other example I have it's actually non-Premier League, Kyrie Irving in the NBA fractured his patella. I think he was out 6.5 or 7 or so months. And even then he still had deficits he's talked about afterwards. So yeah, we'll see. It is a tough injury just because it's so rare. And so rehab and surgical protocols aren't really as advanced on it. And then obviously because it's so involved in the function of any movement that you do.
Yeah, disaster for the young lad who, really seemed to sort of step up this season, and he's been one of Wolves' few shining lights, if the truth be known. Even linked with a potentially sort of move to a bigger club in the summer, and I think those have been shelved for now. And we wish him a speedy recovery. But Raj, look, I'm sure we could talk till the cows come home. There's lots more that we haven't even mentioned. Cresswell, Lookman, and so on and so forth. But for now, look, thank you once again, Raj. If you don't know this man, where have you been living? He produces some really top-end content. Please check him out at 3CB Performance. Honestly, you'll thank me later. Thanks again, Raj. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Ben. Talk to you soon.